Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. It was a quiet Saturday evening when Emma Carter decided to make a change. After months of keeping her Instagram account private, she made it public. She'd always been hesitant to let anyone outside her circle of friends see her posts. But recently, she'd been feeling an urge to share her life with a larger audience. Maybe it was the monotony of her small town, or maybe it was the thrill of receiving validation from strangers. Whatever the reason, she hit the Make Public button and felt a sense of freedom, unaware of the darkness it would soon bring. Emma had just turned 20 and had a modest following on Instagram. She shared pictures of her daily life, coffee cups from her favorite cafe, pictures of her cat, and the occasional shot of her hiking adventures. But as her account transitioned to public, things started to change. It began with small interactions, likes and comments from people she didn't recognize, people who didn't seem to be friends of friends. At first, she thought little of it. It was normal, after all, for strangers to stumble upon her account. Then one evening, a new message popped up in her inbox. The profile picture was a black and white photo of a man's silhouette, and the username was a random combination of letters and numbers. The message was simple. "You look nice today. I've been watching your stories." It wasn't the first time she'd received a strange message, but something about this one made her uneasy. The man didn't introduce himself, nor did he make any effort to seem friendly. It felt almost predatory. Emma thought about ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of her. She clicked on the profile, hoping to gain some insight into who this person might be. The account was sparse, just a few photos of random landscapes and a vague bio that read, "In search of the truth." What caught Emma's attention, however, was the follower count. Over 500 people, all of them unverified accounts with no real identities. It seemed strange to her, and a sense of dread crept over her. She decided to block the user and move on, but the nagging feeling stayed with her for the rest of the night. The next day, things took a darker turn. As Emma scrolled through her feed, she noticed something odd. One of her photos from the previous week, an innocent selfie taken at a local park, had been reposted. The caption was simply, "Beautiful," followed by a heart emoji. It wasn't her friend who had shared it, nor had she given anyone permission to repost it. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what was happening. The person who had messaged her the night before had not only seen her post, but had also saved it and shared it with others. Her stomach twisted with the realization that her privacy was being invaded. She immediately went to her account settings and tightened the privacy controls, but deep down, she knew that something was wrong. Later that evening, another message came through. This time it was a photo. It was a picture of Emma's house, her actual home, taken from a distance but clearly her front yard, and it had been taken during the day while she was at work. The caption read, "I love your neighborhood. It's quiet, just like you." Emma's heart raced as she stared at the image on her phone screen. She hadn't posted anything about her house. Her friends and family didn't even know where she lived. But somehow this person had found her address, and now they were watching her. In a panic, Emma blocked the account again, this time reporting it to Instagram as well. But as she closed her phone, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She looked around her apartment, but everything seemed normal. The lights were on, the curtains drawn, the street outside peaceful and quiet. Yet, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. She was no longer alone in her own life. The messages continued for days, each one becoming more unsettling. The mysterious account kept sending her cryptic photos, images of places she'd visited, of people she'd met. They were always just a little off, like someone was following her without her knowledge. A picture from a coffee shop she'd visited last week, a shot of her at a bookstore where she'd been alone. Every message felt like a step closer to something sinister. The final straw came one night when Emma was sitting in her apartment, reading a book and trying to distract herself. Her phone buzzed with another notification. It was a video message. She hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The video was grainy, but Emma could make out the figure of a man standing in the shadows near a streetlight. He was wearing a dark hoodie and his face was obscured by the brim of his hat. As the camera moved, Emma's heart stopped. She saw the street just outside her building. Then, the figure turned and started walking toward her apartment. The video cut to black, but the message that followed made her blood run cold. "I know you're home, Emma. I've been watching you." She immediately called the police, her hands shaking as she recounted everything. They told her they'd send an officer to investigate, but Emma didn't feel safe. The house felt like a trap, the walls closing in on her. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept the lights on and the doors locked, but every creak and groan of the apartment building made her jump. She kept thinking about the man in the video. Had he really been outside? Or had he somehow been inside her home already? The police arrived the next morning, but there was no sign of the man from the video. The area was checked thoroughly, and Emma was advised to keep her account private again and report any further incidents immediately. Emma followed their advice, but deep down, she knew that the man, the tracker, was still out there. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Though the police assured her it was over, Emma couldn't return to the life she once had. The fear, the paranoia, the constant looking over her shoulder, these were now her reality. And every time she heard a new notification on her phone, she wondered if it was him, ready to send another chilling message. No matter how many precautions she took, she knew one thing for sure. The tracker was always watching. It was a warm summer evening when I decided to drive across the state for a much-needed break. I had been working long hours and felt the exhaustion creeping into my bones. The road ahead was long, stretching across miles of empty highways with only the occasional passing truck or car. I had no particular destination in mind, just the need to clear my head. As I drove, the night grew darker and the road ahead seemed endless. I passed small towns, each one darker and quieter than the last, until I reached a stretch of highway that felt eerily isolated. It was at that point when I first noticed the car behind me. At first, it was just another vehicle keeping pace with mine. I didn't think much of it. After all, the highway was long, and it was common for other drivers to follow similar routes. But as I continued driving, I noticed that the car seemed to be sticking unnaturally close to mine. No matter how fast I went, it kept pace. I tried to shrug it off, but the uneasy feeling began to grow. I couldn't help but glance at my rearview mirror more often, seeing the same headlights glaring back at me, always there, always following. My heart began to race. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I thought. Maybe the person was heading to the same place, or maybe I was being paranoid. After what felt like hours, I finally decided to stop at a small motel to rest. It wasn't a place I had planned to stay, but I was too tired to go any further. The motel looked old and quiet, the kind of place that only travelers or truckers would stop at. I parked my car, stretched my legs, and went inside to check in. The strange thing was, when I stepped into the lobby to pay for my room, I noticed that the car that had been following me was parked in the lot. It was still running, the headlights illuminating the small area. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another coincidence, I told myself. Maybe the driver needed a break too. I took my key and headed up to my room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. The room itself was simple, with dim lights and an old bed. I locked the door behind me and crawled into bed, trying to get some sleep, but the unease wouldn't leave me. It felt as if someone was still watching, as if something wasn't right. Around midnight, as I lay there in the dark, trying to force myself to sleep, I heard a faint sound, like the faintest tap on the window. I froze, listening. The tap came again, a soft rattle against the glass. My heart skipped a beat. My first thought was that it was just the wind, or maybe a branch from a nearby tree. but something told me it wasn't. I opened my eyes slowly and turned to face the window. The motel room was small and the window was just within reach from the bed. As I stared into the darkness outside, I saw nothing at first. Then, just as my nerves were beginning to settle, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall, dark, and standing outside my window, staring directly at me. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes were unmistakable. His gaze was intense, almost unblinking. I could feel the chill creep down my spine as I stared back at him, too terrified to move or scream. The man didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked with mine. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I could hear his footsteps on the gravel, retreating into the night. I rushed to the window, but by the time I got there, the area outside was empty. There was no trace of the man. The car in the parking lot was gone too. My pulse was racing, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I had no idea who the man was or why he had been watching me. The car that had been following me earlier. I wasn't sure anymore. Was it the same person? Had he followed me all this way? The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep a wink, my eyes constantly darting to the window, to the door, to the shadows in the room. Every creak, every sound made me jump. The fear that something or someone was out there never left me. The next morning, I left the motel as early as I could, desperate to put the night behind me. I drove for hours, trying to forget the feeling of being watched, but every mile, every turn felt like I was being followed. The highway stretched out in front of me, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the fear that the strange man was still out there, watching, waiting. I've never been able to forget that night. The man at the window, the car following me, the feeling of being stalked on that lonely stretch of highway. I've driven that same road a few times since then, but I've never stopped at that motel again. And though I never saw the man again, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, still following, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The strange thing is, I've never been able to find an explanation for what happened that night. Who was that man? Why did he follow me all that way? And what was he waiting for? I've never found the answers, and maybe I never will. But the fear still lingers, and the thought that something is out there, watching, waiting, is a thought that I can't shake. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, excited to escape the stress of our daily lives and spend a few days in the great outdoors. We chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a place none of us had ever been before, but the idea of being surrounded by nature, away from technology, seemed perfect. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the trees. The air was crisp and smelled of pine, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the silence. We set up our tents quickly and started a campfire, the flickering flames casting an orange glow on our faces. As we settled in, we joked around, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, but as night fell, something felt off. The woods around us grew darker, and the usual sounds of nocturnal animals seemed to vanish. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and an eerie silence followed. It wasn't long before I started to feel uneasy. It was as though the forest itself was watching us. Around midnight, we decided to take a walk around the campsite. The moon was barely visible, and our flashlights illuminated only a small patch of the trail ahead. As we walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of our footsteps seemed to echo in the distance, and the air grew colder. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our lights, stood a figure. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be, but something was off. He was dressed in dark clothes, blending in with the shadows, and he wasn't moving. His posture was unnaturally still, and his face was obscured by the hood of his jacket. We stopped dead in our tracks. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Who was this man, and what was he doing out here in the middle of the night? "Hey, are you okay?" one of my friends called out. his voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there staring into the dark, motionless. "Maybe he's lost," another friend whispered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air around us felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I wanted to turn and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Then, just as we were about to turn around and head back to the campsite, the figure finally moved. But it wasn't a normal movement. It was jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. The figure began to walk towards us, slowly at first, then faster and faster, as if drawn by some invisible force. Panic surged through me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen. My friends were in the same state, staring in disbelief as the man's pace quickened. Without warning, the figure broke into a sprint, charging straight at us with terrifying speed. We all screamed and bolted in different directions, the sound of our footsteps pounding against the earth as we ran through the dark woods. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer, but I didn't dare look back. I ran for what felt like miles, my breath ragged and my heart racing. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally stumbled upon the campsite. I could see the faint light of the campfire in the distance, and I ran toward it, collapsing onto the ground as soon as I reached the safety of the fire. My friends arrived one by one, all of us breathless and terrified. We gathered around the fire, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but none of us could explain it. There had been no sign of the man when we had turned to run, and the woods seemed completely silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. We stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, jumping at every rustle in the leaves. In the morning, we packed up our things and left the campsite, never speaking a word about what we had seen. We never returned to that forest. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that figure in the woods. His eyes, hidden in the shadows of his hood, and the way he moved. It wasn't human, and I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting in the dark, watching for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble upon him. Whatever he was, I know one thing for sure. We were not supposed to be there. It was a typical summer evening when my best friend Sam and I decided to explore the old abandoned mansion on the edge of town. The place had been empty for years, ever since the last owner, an eccentric elderly woman, mysteriously vanished without a trace. The mansion had become a subject of local legend, with rumors swirling about strange noises and flickering lights being seen late at night. Being the curious thrill-seekers we were, we couldn't resist. We had heard the stories of doors opening by themselves, whispers in the dark, and objects moving when no one was around. But we didn't believe in any of it. It was just a creepy old house, nothing more. We arrived at the mansion around dusk, the tall, decaying structure looming before us like a forgotten relic. The windows were boarded up and the front gate was rusted, but the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. Our hearts raced with excitement, but also a hint of nervousness. We had to push our fears aside. With a deep breath, Sam pushed the door open, and we stepped into the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and mildew filled our noses. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. We explored the lower level first, walking through the grand yet decaying living room, past old portraits of people long forgotten. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as though the house had been frozen in time. We tried to make light of the situation, cracking jokes and taking pictures with our phones, but the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Then, we heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, came from somewhere deep within the house. We froze in place, our eyes widening in disbelief. I turned to Sam, but his expression mirrored mine, pale, wide-eyed, and unsure of what we had just heard. The whispering grew louder, as though someone was speaking directly into our ears. It sounded like muffled words, but the language was strange, foreign even. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaking. "Let's get out of here." But just as we turned to leave, the whispering stopped. replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It was like something was breathing, slowly and heavily, right behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Sam grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and pulled me toward the staircase at the far end of the hall. We made our way up to the second floor, hoping to find some answers, or at the very least, escape whatever was lurking on the first floor. As we reached the top, the atmosphere grew colder. A strange fog seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls, wrapping itself around us. The house was growing more oppressive by the second. We ventured down the hallway, where we noticed a door at the end, slightly ajar. It looked like it had been untouched for years, and a strange low light flickered from inside. Against our better judgment, we approached the door. As we pushed it open, a wave of cold air rushed out, and we stepped into what appeared to be a small study. The room was covered in dust, with books scattered across the floor and old papers strewn about. But it wasn't the mess that caught our attention. It was the mirror on the far wall. The mirror was large, framed in dark, intricately carved wood. But what made it strange was the fact that the reflection was not our own. Instead, the mirror reflected a dimly lit room with shadows moving within it. We both stared at it, frozen as the shadows began to shift and take form. Figures, translucent and dark, seemed to emerge from the edges of the glass, and they slowly started to circle around the room, their movements unnatural, like puppets being controlled by some invisible force. The whispering started again, louder now, and the figures in the mirror began to speak. They spoke in a language we couldn't understand, their voices distorted and echoing in our minds. The air around us grew thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further. We could see our breath in the air now, as the shadows continued to swirl around in the mirror. Sam and I backed away slowly, but it felt like the room itself was closing in on us. The whispers turned to screams, and the figures in the mirror started to reach out toward us, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving dark, smudged marks. We turned and ran, not looking back, as the screams followed us down the hallway. We burst through the front door and into the night, our hearts pounding in our chests. The mansion loomed behind us, silent once again, but we knew we had escaped something that had been waiting for us. We never spoke about what we saw that night. We couldn't. It was as if speaking of it would make it real, and we couldn't bear the thought of returning to that place. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house. All I know is that whatever it was not of this world. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, just faintly, lingering in the back of my mind, calling me back to that dark, forgotten mansion. It was supposed to be the perfect New Year's Eve getaway. My friends and I had rented a small hotel room in a secluded part of town, far away from the typical celebrations and fireworks. We were all excited to ring in the new year together, but there was one thing that made this trip a bit different from the rest. We had planned a prank for our friend, James. James was the kind of guy who never let anyone pull anything over on him. He was always the one pranking others, so we thought it would be hilarious to turn the tables on him. The plan was simple. We would convince him that the hotel was haunted. It was a perfect setup. Our hotel was old, isolated, and had a reputation for strange occurrences. We figured a few creepy noises and some spooky decorations would be enough to get him on edge. We arrived at the hotel early in the evening, before the sun had even set. The place looked like something out of an old horror movie, with its cracked windows and peeling paint. It had been around for decades, and the creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper gave it an eerie charm. We checked in, excited to get things started, and made our way to the room, where we began setting up the prank. We placed old, dusty books on the shelves, made strange marks on the bathroom mirror, and even set up a few sound effects to make it seem like something was lurking in the shadows. James had no idea what was coming. We told him that we had rented the room because it had the best view of the fireworks and the party downstairs, but we made sure to downplay how creepy the hotel looked. He was the last one to arrive, and as soon as he walked through the door, we could see the grin on his face as he immediately started teasing us about how old and haunted the place looked. The plan was to let him settle in for a bit, then start the haunting by playing some eerie sounds from my phone and acting a little spooked. But things took a strange turn as the night progressed. At first it was subtle, just a few things that seemed off. The lights flickered a few times, but we shrugged it off as a faulty electrical system. Then, as we were getting ready to celebrate the arrival of the new year, we heard a faint scratching sound coming from the closet. James, being the prankster he was quick to jump at the chance to scare us back. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. We all laughed it off, but the atmosphere in the room had started to feel wrong. The air was thick, almost heavy, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. James joked about the place being haunted again, but none of us were laughing anymore. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the noises grew louder. Faint footsteps could be heard from the hallway outside, though when we checked, no one was there. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath in the air. The candles on the nightstand flickered wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. The tension in the room was palpable, and we couldn't explain what was happening. Then, just as we were about to sit down and toast to the new year, something truly bizarre occurred. The bathroom door, which had been closed all night, creaked open on its own. We stared at it in shock, unsure of what to do. James, trying to maintain his bravado, walked over to the door and peeked inside. To our horror, the bathroom light turned on by itself. "Okay, this is starting to freak me out," James said, his voice shaky for the first time that night. We all stood there, frozen, when suddenly we heard it. A low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere within the hotel. It echoed through the walls, sending shivers down our spines. It wasn't any of us, and it definitely wasn't coming from the TV or radio. It was a voice that sounded as if it came from the very walls themselves. Panicked, we scrambled to get our things together, but the room seemed to be closing in on us. The door to the hallway wouldn't open, no matter how hard we pulled at the handle. We banged on the windows, but the storm outside had trapped us in. The wind howled, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above us grew louder, as if something, or someone, was moving between the floors. We could hear whispering now, too, low, almost inaudible murmurs that seemed to come from every corner of the room. We couldn't understand the words, but they were undeniably real, and they filled us with dread. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, warning us of something we couldn't see. By the time the clock struck midnight, none of us could stay in the room any longer. We tried to leave, but the door to the hallway still wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized that something in the hotel didn't want us to leave. The room felt like a trap, like something was keeping us there, and we were powerless to escape. Finally, after what felt like hours of struggling and hearing strange noises, the door swung open on its own. We rushed out into the hallway, only to find it completely empty. No one else was staying in the hotel, or so we thought. But when we turned to go downstairs, we saw them, shadowy figures standing at the far end of the hallway, watching us. We ran, heart pounding, down the creaky staircase and out into the cold night air. As soon as we were outside, the temperature returned to normal, and the sounds from the hotel ceased. We looked at each other, our faces pale, unsure of what had just happened. We never spoke of that night again. We didn't even stay to watch the fireworks. The hotel was abandoned shortly after our visit, and the rumors began to spread. They say that every year on New Year's Eve, the hotel comes alive with the echoes of its past, trapping anyone who dares to spend the night. We were lucky, at least we think we were, but we'll never be able to forget the whispers, the shadows, and the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to come back, and we never will. I've always lived in quiet neighborhoods, the kind where the most exciting event of the year is someone repainting their mailbox. So when the small, vine-covered house next door was finally bought after years of sitting empty, I thought nothing of it. The new resident moved in under the cover of night, and I didn't even get a glimpse of them. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed something strange. The garden in front of the house was blooming with flowers I had never seen before, their vibrant colors almost unnaturally vivid. At first, I brushed it off as a skilled gardener making their mark, but as the days went by, more peculiarities surfaced. I never saw the new neighbor come or go. No car was ever parked in the driveway. The lights in the house flickered on and off at odd hours, and strange, humming noises could be heard late at night. Still, I figured they were just reclusive, maybe eccentric, but harmless. That changed the day I met him. I was trimming the hedges in my yard when I heard a voice behind me. "You're quite meticulous," the man said. I turned around, startled, to see someone standing by the low fence that separated our properties. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black coat that seemed too heavy for the warm weather. His face was pale, his eyes a piercing shade of green that seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight. Thanks," I replied, unsure how to respond. "You must be the new neighbor." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me Elias," he said, extending a hand. His fingers were long and cold, his grip firm. "I hope we can be good neighbors." Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I nodded and returned to my work. Elias lingered a moment longer before walking back into his house, and for the first time, I noticed the way the shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he moved. Over the next few weeks, the unease I felt about Elias grew. Strange things started happening in the neighborhood. Pets went missing, and some of the older trees in nearby yards withered overnight. My other neighbors whispered about Elias, but no one dared confront him. His presence was unsettling, but it wasn't until I had a direct encounter with the inexplicable that I began to truly fear him. It was late one night when I saw it, a faint, flickering light coming from Elias's backyard. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the slats in my fence. What I saw made my blood run cold. Elias stood in the center of a glowing circle etched into the ground, its lines shimmering with an otherworldly light. Symbols I couldn't comprehend were scrawled across the grass, and hovering above the circle was something unnatural. It looked like a shadow-given form, shifting and writhing in the air. Elias was chanting in a language I couldn't understand, his voice low and rhythmic. Before I could look away, his head snapped up, and those piercing green eyes locked onto mine. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and bolted inside my house. For the rest of the night, I kept every light on and double-checked all the locks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, Elias was back to his usual self, gardening in his front yard as if nothing had happened. But when he saw me, his smile was different, wider, colder, as if he knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said casually as I walked by. "Some things are best left unknown." I didn't respond. Over the next few days, my life became a waking nightmare. Doors in my house that I was sure I had locked were found ajar. Objects moved from their usual places. Once, I woke in the middle of the night to find my bedroom window open, though I hadn't touched it. The final straw came when I found my dog, Max, cowering in the corner of the living room, his fur bristling. When I tried to comfort him, he whimpered and backed away, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. Desperate for answers, I did something I never thought I'd do. I confronted Elias. It was early evening, and I caught him as he was tending to his unnervingly vibrant garden. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "What's happening to me?" Elias looked up, his expression unreadable. "You've seen too much," he said simply. "The world is full of things that most people are better off ignoring. You should have stayed ignorant." I felt a surge of anger. "You don't scare me," I said, though my voice wavered. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Bravery and foolishness often go hand in hand," he said. "But if you insist on meddling, perhaps you'd like a demonstration of what you're dealing with." Before I could react, he raised a hand, and the world around me seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, and the colors of the evening dimmed, as if someone had turned down the saturation of reality. Shadows crawled across the ground, coalescing into shapes that defied explanation. I stumbled back, terror gripping me as whispers filled my ears, speaking in that same incomprehensible language I had heard before. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The world snapped back into focus, and Elias stood there, watching me with a calm, almost bored expression. "Leave me be," he said. "This is your only warning." I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I started looking into the history of the house Elias lived in, and what I found was chilling. Every tenant who had lived there before him had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their belongings left behind as if they had simply ceased to exist. I tried to tell the police, but there was no evidence to support my claims. Elias was untouchable, and I was left to live with the knowledge that something truly unnatural resided next door. I've thought about moving, but I know in my heart it wouldn't matter. Wherever I go, Elias's parting words echo in my mind. Some things can't be escaped no matter how far you run. It all started as a harmless experiment. Anna had recently moved to a new city and, feeling isolated, decided to try out a dating app. She wasn't desperate for love or anything. She just wanted to meet new people and maybe share a laugh over coffee. After scrolling through countless profiles, she came across one that stood out. His name was Elliot. His profile picture was simple: a clean-shaven man with striking dark eyes, a sharp jawline, and an inviting smile. His bio was witty but modest. Just a guy who loves hiking, old bookstores, and terrible dad jokes. He seemed genuine, the kind of person you'd feel at ease talking to. Anna swiped right, and to her surprise, they matched instantly. Within minutes, Elliot messaged her. His words were charming and thoughtful, steering clear of the typical shallow compliments. He seemed genuinely interested in her passions, her favorite books, and why she had moved to the city. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and after a week of texting back and forth, Elliot suggested meeting in person. He proposed a quaint little cafe near her apartment, one she had mentioned loving in their chats. Flattered by his attention to detail, she agreed. The day of the date, Anna arrived at the cafe, her stomach fluttering with a mix of nerves and excitement. Elliot was already there, seated at a corner table. He looked just like his picture, maybe even better. His smile was warm, and his presence was magnetic. The date went perfectly. They laughed, shared stories, and discovered they had even more in common than their online chats had revealed. But there was something about Elliot, something just slightly off. His answers about his own life were vague. He never mentioned family or close friends, and when she asked where he worked, he simply said he was between jobs. Still, Anna chalked it up to first date jitters. Everyone had their guard up a little at the start, right? As they parted ways, Elliot leaned in close. "I had a great time, Anna. Let's do this again soon," he said, his voice low and soothing. She nodded, smiling. But as she walked away, she felt an inexplicable chill, as if she were being watched. Over the next few days, Elliot's behavior became odd. He texted constantly, and while some of the messages were sweet, others were invasive. He seemed to know things about her she hadn't shared, details about her daily routine, the color of the sweater she wore to the cafe, even the exact time she had left for work one morning. When she asked him how he knew, he would dodge the question or play it off as a lucky guess. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Anna received a message from Elliot. "You look beautiful tonight." Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around her apartment, every hair on her body standing on end. Her blinds were drawn, and her doors were locked. There was no way he could see her. She texted back, "How do you know what I look like right now?" Elliot's reply came almost instantly. "Lucky guess. Sleep well, Anna." By now, Anna was uneasy. She stopped replying to Elliot's messages and avoided the dating app entirely. But Elliot didn't stop. The messages kept coming, each one more unnerving than the last. "I don't like being ignored. You're too good for those guys at work. Why don't we go for a walk tonight? I know your favorite park." One evening, Anna came home to find a single red rose on her doorstep. There was no note, but she knew it was from him. Panic set in. She reported his profile on the app and blocked his number, but it didn't help. The next night, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Blocking me won't keep us apart." Anna's blood ran cold. She called the police, but without concrete evidence of a threat, there was little they could do. Determined to take matters into her own hands, Anna started researching Elliot. She scoured social media, trying to find any trace of him, but it was as if he didn't exist. His profile on the app had vanished, and every detail he had shared with her seemed to lead to a dead end. One night, as she was deep in her search, her power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and the hum of her laptop died abruptly. Grabbing her phone, Anna turned on the flashlight and made her way to the breaker box in the hallway. As she fumbled with the switches, she heard a noise behind her, a soft, deliberate knock on her front door. Her breath caught in her throat. She stayed silent, hoping whoever it was would go away. The knock came again, louder this time, and then a voice. "Anna, it's me. Open up, I just want to talk." It was Elliot. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the door. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You can't avoid me forever," he said. "I'll see you soon." The next day, Anna packed a bag and stayed with a friend across town. She couldn't stay in her apartment, not with Elliot knowing where she lived. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The messages stopped, and there was no sign of Elliot. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. One evening, while she was out shopping with her friend, Anna's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a photo, a picture of her, taken just moments ago standing in the store. Panic set in as she looked around, her eyes darting from face to face. Whoever had taken the picture was gone, but the message was clear. Elliot wasn't finished with her. To this day, Anna doesn't know how Elliot found her or what he truly wanted. She deleted the dating app and moved to a new city, but the experience left her scarred. Sometimes she wonders if she's truly free of him. Every so often she catches a glimpse of a figure in the crowd, a tall man with piercing eyes and a familiar, unsettling smile. And every time, she can't help but wonder if Elliot has found her again. It started as an innocent hobby. Evan loved reading spooky stories on Reddit, especially on r/nosleep, where people shared terrifying tales that blurred the line between fiction and reality. The community was a goldmine of creativity, with chilling narratives that often left him double-checking his locks at night. One day, Evan stumbled upon a thread titled, "Don't Ignore the Page." It wasn't on r/nosleep, but a lesser-known subreddit called r/fearunfiltered. The post caught his eye because it had no upvotes, no comments, and the user who posted it had a bizarre name, Shadowlurker78. The post itself was cryptic. "Once you see the page, it sees you back. Don't look too long or you'll regret it. Remember, it's never just a story." Underneath the text was a single link. Evan hesitated. He knew better than to click random links on Reddit, but curiosity got the better of him. With a sigh, he tapped it. The link led to an unfamiliar web page. The design was basic, almost like a forgotten relic from the early days of the internet. The title at the top read, "The Shadow Chronicles." The page was stark, just black text on a white background, with one story available to read, "The Watcher." Evan clicked on the story, and the page loaded instantly. It was written in the second person, making it feel uncomfortably personal. You're sitting alone at your desk, reading this story. The room is quiet except for the faint hum of your computer. You think you're safe, but you're wrong. The Watcher knows you're here. It always does. Evan smirked. Classic horror writing. Nothing he hadn't seen before. But as he scrolled further, his smirk faded. The story began describing things that felt eerily specific to him. You glance at the coffee mug beside you, the one with the chipped handle that you can't bring yourself to throw away. You haven't noticed the shadow in the corner of your room, have you? It's been there for hours watching. Evan's eyes darted to his coffee mug. The handle was indeed chipped, just as the story described. His heart raced as he glanced toward the corner of his room. There was nothing there. Shaking his head, he muttered, "It's just a coincidence," and kept reading. You're telling yourself it's just a coincidence, but you're wrong. It knows you're doubting, and it's moving closer. Don't turn around. Don't stop reading. Evan froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Against his better judgment, he turned around. The room was empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. He slammed his laptop shut, his breathing shallow. "It's just a dumb story," he said to himself. But that night, he struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, felt amplified, like something, or someone, was creeping closer. The next morning, Evan decided to revisit the page. He wanted to prove to himself that it was all in his head. But when he opened the link, the page wouldn't load. A 404 error message appeared instead. Confused, he went back to Reddit to check the original thread, but it was gone too. Even Shadow Lurker 78's account had vanished. A cold unease settled over him. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was probably some elaborate prank. Yet as the days went by, strange things began to happen. At first it was minor. Objects in his apartment seemed slightly out of place. Lights flickered without reason, and he heard faint tapping noises at night. But then it escalated. One evening, while scrolling Reddit, he noticed a new message in his inbox. It was from a username he didn't recognize. "The Watcher is real." The message was short. "Stop looking. It's too late now." Evan's stomach churned. He clicked on the profile, but it was empty. No posts, no comments, just the ominous username. The following night, the tapping noises returned, louder this time. Evan lay in bed, clutching his blanket like a lifeline. The sound was coming from his window, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that sent chills down his spine. Summoning his courage, he approached the window and peeked through the curtains. There was nothing there. No branches, no birds, just the still night. But as he turned away, his phone buzzed on his nightstand. It was another message from the Watcher, his real. "You shouldn't have looked outside." Evan's hands shook as he read the message. How did they know? He wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Evan deleted his Reddit account, disconnected his laptop, and even changed his phone number. But the messages didn't stop. They came in different forms. Emails from untraceable addresses, notes slipped under his door, and once, a chilling whisper on the other end of a phone call. "It's closer than you think, Evan." He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, consumed by the fear that the Watcher was always near. His friends grew concerned, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he? They'd think he was crazy. One night, Evan decided he'd had enough. He couldn't live like this anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, he sat in his living room, determined to confront whatever was tormenting him. Hours passed in tense silence. Just as he was beginning to think it was all in his head, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the door. Evan gripped the bat tightly, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice whispered through the door. "You invited me in when you clicked the page." The door creaked open, though Evan hadn't touched it. The flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Evan dropped the bat, his legs frozen in place. The last thing he remembered was the figure stepping closer, its dark form engulfing him completely. Evan was never seen again. Some say his disappearance was a case of foul play. Others believe he simply ran away. But those who frequent r/Fear Unfiltered know the truth. The thread titled, "Don't Ignore the Page," occasionally reappears, posted by different usernames, always leading to the same mysterious link. And every time someone clicks it, another person vanishes. It started with a house call. Emma was an electrician in a small, quiet town. Her job rarely involved anything more thrilling than fixing blown fuses or replacing faulty wiring. That's why, when she got a call about an old abandoned lighthouse on the edge of town, she was intrigued. The owner, Mr. Whitaker, was a distant relative of the lighthouse's original keeper and had recently inherited the property. He wanted to restore it, claiming he had plans to turn it into a tourist attraction. "The electrical system's ancient," he had said over the phone, "but there's something strange going on. The light flickers, even though the place hasn't had power in decades." Emma arrived at the lighthouse just as the sun was setting. The structure loomed against the orange sky, its silhouette both majestic and foreboding. A chilling wind blew in from the sea, carrying the salty tang of the ocean. Mr. Whitaker greeted her at the base of the lighthouse, his face pale and drawn. "It happens most often at night," he explained, his voice hushed as if he feared being overheard. "The light, it's like it's alive. I thought I was imagining things until the neighbors started talking about seeing it from across the bay." Emma, skeptical but intrigued, set to work. Inside, the lighthouse was cold and damp. The air smelled of mildew and salt, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks echoed faintly through the thick walls. She inspected the ancient wiring, surprised to find that most of it was intact but completely disconnected from any power source. "It's impossible for this light to work," she muttered to herself. But as she climbed the spiral staircase toward the lantern room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At the top, the lantern room was eerily pristine. The massive glass lens, despite years of disuse, gleamed in the dim light of her flashlight. As she examined the mechanism, the hair on her arms stood on end. Then it happened. The light flickered on, bathing the room in an otherworldly glow. Emma stumbled back, shielding her eyes. The light was impossibly bright, yet there was no heat, no hum of electricity, just an unnatural, silent brilliance. When she turned around, she saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadows. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was suffocating. Emma blinked, and the figure was gone. Rattled but determined, Emma descended the staircase. "Probably just my imagination," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But as she reached the bottom, Mr. Whitaker was nowhere to be found. His truck was still parked outside, but the man himself had vanished. She called his name, her voice echoing against the cliffs, but there was no response. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, the lighthouse came alive. The light began to spin, casting long, eerie beams across the landscape. Each rotation seemed to illuminate something different. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, fleeting glimpses of figures standing on the rocks, staring up at the tower. Emma's heart pounded. She backed away from the lighthouse, only to hear the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. Desperate for answers, Emma climbed back inside. The staircase seemed longer this time, twisting in impossible ways. Her flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. When she finally reached the lantern room again, the figure was waiting for her. This time it was clearer, an old man in a weathered uniform, his face pale and expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low, mournful whisper. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The man stepped closer, his eyes filled with an unspeakable sorrow. "The light isn't for you." Before she could move, the lantern's glow enveloped her, pulling her into its blinding embrace. The next morning, Mr. Whitaker's truck was still parked by the lighthouse. The local authorities searched the area but found no sign of him or Emma. The lighthouse remained dark and silent, its lens cracked and covered in dust. But at night across the bay, people swore they could still see the light spinning, casting its spectral glow across the water. And if you stood close enough, you might hear faint whispers in the wind, calling out from the depths of the lighthouse, "The light isn't for you." Would you like more story ideas or further development on this one? It was nearly midnight when Lucas pulled his car into the gravel lot of the roadside diner. The neon sign flickered weakly, the word "open" barely legible in the fog that rolled in off the highway. He'd been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, and the thought of a hot cup of coffee was too tempting to resist. The diner was nearly empty. A waitress leaned against the counter, lazily flipping through a magazine, while a trucker sat hunched over a plate of greasy fries at the far end of the room. Lucas took a seat in a booth by the window, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "What can I get you?" the waitress asked, her voice flat. "Just coffee, please," Lucas replied. As she poured the steaming liquid into a chipped mug, the bell above the door jingled. Lucas glanced up to see a man step inside. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in an old threadbare suit that seemed out of place. His eyes were dark and hollow, and his thin lips curved into a small, unsettling smile as he scanned the room. The man didn't sit down. Instead, he stood by the door, staring at Lucas with a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Something wrong?" the waitress asked, noticing Lucas's unease. "No, it's nothing," Lucas said quickly, turning his attention back to his coffee. But when he glanced up again, the man was gone. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sound of footsteps. "Did you see where that guy went?" Lucas asked. The waitress frowned. "What guy?" Shaking off the encounter, Lucas finished his coffee and left a few bills on the table. As he walked back to his car, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He turned to look behind him, but saw only the empty parking lot and the flickering neon sign. The drive resumed in silence, the dark highway stretching endlessly ahead. The fog thickened, swallowing the headlights and muffling the sound of the tires on the asphalt. Then, in the rearview mirror, Lucas saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, faint and indistinct. But as he squinted, the figure of the man from the diner came into focus, sitting in the back seat of his car, smiling that same eerie smile. Lucas slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He spun around, but the back seat was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. "It's just the fatigue," he muttered. "I'm imagining things." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The next hour was a blur of twisting roads and creeping fear. Every time Lucas glanced at the rearview mirror, the man was there, closer than before. His smile never wavered, and his hollow eyes seemed to pierce straight through him. Desperate for help, Lucas spotted a gas station up ahead. He swerved into the lot, his tires screeching, and ran inside. The attendant looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay, man?" "There's someone following me," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I need to use your phone." The attendant handed over the phone, but as Lucas dialed, the lights in the station flickered. A deep, unnatural cold filled the room, and the air seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Is he here?" Lucas whispered. The attendant didn't respond. When Lucas turned, he saw that the man in the suit was standing at the entrance, his smile wider now, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "What do you want?" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. The man raised a hand, his fingers impossibly long and thin. "You shouldn't have stopped at the diner," he said, his voice low and resonant, as if it came from everywhere at once. Before Lucas could move, the man took a step forward, and the room dissolved into darkness. Lucas woke up in his car, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, casting warm light over the landscape. For a moment he thought it had all been a dream, but when he checked the rearview mirror, he saw a single pale finger smeared across the glass, as though someone had traced it from the inside, and on the dashboard sat a crumpled, faded business card. It read, "See you again soon. Would you like more eerie twists or a different setting for the next one?" It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Kara, Lily, and James had rented a secluded cabin near Whispering Lake, nestled deep in the woods. The area was famous for its untouched beauty, and the lake's still, mirror-like surface was the perfect backdrop for a much-needed break from their hectic city lives. The first day passed uneventfully. They hiked through the forest, grilled burgers by the cabin, and joked about ghost stories they'd heard growing up. As the sun set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, they decided to take a walk down to the lake. I read online that this place is called Whispering Lake because people say they've heard voices coming from the water, Lily said, her tone playful but with a hint of unease. Ghost stories to scare the tourists, James replied with a smirk. But nice try. Kara stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the lake. Something about it unnerved her. The surface was unnaturally still, with no ripples or signs of life. Not even the faintest breeze disturbed the water. That night, Kara woke up to a faint sound. It was a low, rhythmic whisper, just barely audible over the wind rustling the trees. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. "Kara." Her blood turned cold. The voice wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from outside. She tiptoed to the window and peeked out. The moonlight illuminated the forest, casting long, eerie shadows. But nothing moved. "Kara." The voice was louder now, clearer. Against her better judgment, she opened the door and stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been earlier, and the whisper seemed to wrap around her like a chilling breeze. It was coming from the direction of the lake. The next morning, she told Lily and James about what she'd heard. "You probably dreamt it," James said, shrugging. "I'm telling you it was real," Kara insisted. "It knew my name." Lily looked uneasy. "There's something about this place that feels wrong," she admitted. "I've been having weird dreams. It's like the lake is calling to me." James rolled his eyes. "You two are just scaring yourselves. Look, if it makes you feel better, we'll check it out tonight. Maybe it's just the wind or some weird echo." As night fell, they ventured down to the lake with flashlights. The air was heavy and the forest was unnervingly quiet. Even the usual hum of crickets was absent. When they reached the shore, the whispers began. "Kara, Lily, James." The three of them froze. The voices were soft but unmistakable, echoing across the water. "Who's there?" James shouted, his bravado faltering. The whispers didn't answer. Instead, the water began to ripple, small waves lapping at the shore despite the stillness of the air. Lily grabbed Kara's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But James stepped closer to the water, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "There's something out there," he muttered. "Kara, Lily, James." The whispers grew louder, overlapping and distorting until they became a chorus of incomprehensible sounds. And then they saw it. A figure rose from the water, its form shadowy and indistinct. It was neither fully human nor entirely monstrous, its features shifting and writhing like the surface of the lake. Its eyes were empty voids, and yet they seemed to see everything. James stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. "Run!" he shouted. They sprinted through the forest, the whispers following them, growing louder and more frantic. The shadows seemed to move, twisting into unnatural shapes that reached for them as they passed. When they finally reached the cabin, Lily slammed the door shut and locked it. "What was that?" she gasped, her voice trembling. Kara peeked out the window, but the forest was still again. No whispers, no figures, just silence. "We're leaving at first light," she said. But the lake had other plans. That night they heard the whispers again. This time they came from inside the cabin. "Kara, Lily, James." The lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. The whispers turned into laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. The door creaked open, though no one had touched it. Outside, the lake glowed faintly under the moonlight, beckoning them. "It wants us to go back," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Kara said firmly. "We stay here until morning." But James was gone. They found him standing by the lake, his eyes blank, his body rigid. The water swirled around his feet, pulling him in inch by inch. "James!" Kara screamed, running toward him. The whispers drowned out her voice, and before she could reach him, he disappeared beneath the surface. When the sun rose, the lake was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But Kara and Lily knew the truth. Whispering Lake wasn't just a legend, it was alive. Would you like more eerie stories, or should I develop this one further? Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.